this moment, I'm starting the record of these sessions. You will be able to find all the recorded session on our webpage, and to watch the videos if you don't have anything to do. Is a nice way to spend your Sundays. Next July, we will have another last session of the academic year on radical left parties and national identity in Spain, Italy, and Portugal. It will be a book discussion. But now I stop talking, and I will give the floor to Tiago to introduce our today seminar and guest that I really thank very much for being here.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to presenters of today, which are many, so I'll have a lot to say. So today we'll have a session on climate futures and just transformation, agency and people political imaginaries. And our speakers today are Tânia Santos from University of Minho, Dora Rebelo from the Center Intervention,
Psychological Research and Social Intervention.
All right, from CIS here at ISCTE, Daniela Ferreira Silva from the University of Minho, Mehmet Ali Üzelgün, did I say it right? All right, thank you. And from here from ISCTE as well, and Anabela Carvalho, also from University of Minho. And it's our great pleasure to receive you here today, and thank you so much. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
So maybe I already put your PowerPoint online so that you can, and after to so, sorry, because they're not used to here. Okay. You have the floor? Okay. Wow, this is such a cozy space for us to all be in. I wasn't expecting this for some reason. We are very, very happy to be here today. When Mali suggested we come here and present this, we thought that this could be an opportunity of showing how our projects throughout the years have been working in different tasks, in different research questions, hence the great amount of speakers today. I'll start by just saying that this is a FCT funded project. It's been ongoing since 2021, if I'm not mistaken, Anabela, 2021, right? And we've had this dream team working with us. I brought their faces here for the ones also that could not be present. It's a joint project with different universities in Portugal involved. Anabela Carvalho is here. Carla Malafaia and Maria Fernandes Jesus are not here today, unfortunately, but we have Mali here with us as well. And us researchers also joining the project later that have been involved in different work packages. So the project was conceived having in mind of how the youth has been very, very vocal in terms of climate change issues. Here are some snippets of the importance of their voice and of their demonstrations and their appearance in the public sphere. So Anabela and Mali, I'm actually presenting this, but I wasn't there in the initial stages, but what we've developed so far is different moments of data collection, different moments of thinking about not only how youth climate activism has been influencing the public sphere and our understanding of climate futures and just transformations, but also the youth, the overall youth and their political agency in these issues. We are presenting here some data on 3 work packages that I highlighted here. So they involved the analysis of narratives of political collectives, youth collectives. They involved also focus groups. They involved the analysis of the media. One first task that was developed was on collecting the climate, or at least mapping the climate movement in Portugal, and this resulted in this these maps and these forms of interactive forms of understanding what the climate movement might look like in Portugal. It's in our website, so I invite all of you to go and check it out. So just for a brief overview of what we are doing here and some of the key theoretical concepts, starting from political agency, perhaps because it's more of an individual characteristic, we conceive it as the ways in which people can think and act upon their wishes and interests, but related to the political structure, and to be able to challenge, to think of ways to challenge norms, cultural beliefs, all that really ingrains society as it is. And this relates to another set of dimensions. One of them is obviously collective action, so the ability of collectively articulating and thinking of ways of working towards those transformations. And underneath it, we've been working with political imaginaries as this dynamic constructions of political realities. So ways in which it orientates expectations, decisions, determines what is political feasible and valuable and what it's not. So different political imaginaries would somehow underpin different democratic understandings. And if we want to think of how the youth can bring about these forms of collective action or their own understanding of political imaginaries, we also need to think of how they are received in society. So this is also a big part of the project, is to really understand how discourses and understandings of climate change and climate change related action are conceived. And we understand that there are certain limits to the climate debate nowadays. And I've put here some references and some understandings that are very much about the lack of diversity of voices and perspectives of when the climate debate is unfolding, a post-political consensus, the dominance of a techno-economic approach to climate change, and imaginary lock-ins. So ways in which we think about climate change that are really not allowing us to think in more structural, in a more transformative way. So some of the proposals or some of the most mainstream ways of understanding how climate change should be mitigated and adapted is very much about certain transformations that are not in depth into the root causes of the problem. So to think about that, for the youth to have a voice and to have an understanding of what the sort of changes that they see that are possible, it's not only necessary, but it requires some sort of collective willingness for that voice to be heard. So again, to touch upon on those limits of the climate debate and the ways in which they can open spaces in which the youth and their concerns and their ways of doing and their ways of understanding change could be somehow debated, could be somehow incorporated and articulated in mainstream and hegemonic understandings of what climate change is about. So to think about this dynamics of the youth having a voice and how this voice is received, Dora will be presenting first on the understandings of the youth of political agency, and here she will be presenting in a more global way different types of youth of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Then Daniela will be focusing in particular on an analysis of collectives, websites, very much collectives that came after the youth climate strike and that have been established throughout the years, and how they imagine political imaginaries, what sort of political imaginaries they are being designed in their discourses and their ways of communicating with the public. And then Mali will be presenting some of the work we've been doing together on how these youth and their actions and how these different political imaginaries are being presented on television. There you see a list of articles. Some of them have been accepted, some of them are still under review, but this is some of the work. So really an opportunity of putting all together here in this presentation. But lastly, I will also would like to talk about of how political imaginaries can be negotiated. And this will be more about of not so much of concrete political imaginaries, but how they are flexible and malleable, and what does that mean for the engaged youth in particular. So now I invite Dora to talk about some of the conceptions of the youth of political agency.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for listening. And so I will be presenting a study that we did in the project that is based on 22 focus group discussions that involved 154 participants divided among 5 cities in Portugal, but mainly Porto and Lisbon. And this was a very diverse group. So young people in secondary school, young people in university, some of them engaged and others not engaged in climate activism. And so these focus groups were developed between October 2022 and April 2023. And so our goal was to examine political agency from a bottom-up perspective through the lenses of this diverse group of young people, and to understand how and under which conditions young people are engaging with climate-related issues and how they see their role in addressing climate change. So from our research, we wanted to understand, first of all, how young people conceptualize their roles, their way of addressing climate change, and then from there, which conceptions can be inferred from these actions. And so we conducted a reflexive thematic analysis, and we have 4 different conceptions of political agency that emerge from our data. The first one being transformational collective action, becoming activists to enact political change. And this particular theme is related to a conception of agency that is shared mainly by young people that are involved in the climate activism movement. And so they perceive themselves as moved by an unwavering commitment to doing something about the climate crisis before it is too late. And also they understood climate activism as a tool that was helpful to develop their own sense of power. And this was substantiated by the social support, the skills development, the critical knowledge, and the hope for a better future that they were able to develop within these groups. And I will show you now a quote from one of the focus group discussions that illustrates this conception of agency. So the participant is underpinning the idea that confrontation is inevitable and actively addressing this topic is important, and this is a way to have power over what is happening. So if he would keep quiet, he would have no agency, he would perceive no power about what is going on. So this is an example of this conception of agency. Then the second one, which we named, if the next one, the next theme or the next conception of agency, we named proto-political collective action to craft political influence. And it relates to several of our participants who were not involved in the climate movement, but they were involved in some form of collective action. And their understanding of collective action was that it was a way to be involved in localized forms of creating influence, to have more power within decision makers and climate policies. So interestingly, these participants, they reflected a sort of tension between, on the one hand, wanting to trust the state and the institutions, but on the other hand, also believing that these actors are not doing enough for the climate. So their idea to handle this tension was to engage in some form of collective action that would produce a little bit more influence. And this would translate in actions like cleaning local beaches or woods, or engaging in pro-environmental actions. Then the third form of agency that we identified, we named individual action through setting example. And this was understood by some of our participants as a way to gain empowerment and individual freedom to make individual choices that could produce some sort of influence, at least in the individual sphere of the person. So these young people were interested in some level of choice like consumerism choices and recycling choices and other behaviors that could at least produce some difference in their daily lives or within their peers or within their families and environments. And one illustrative quote from one of our focus groups is this one. So we have a young person that believes this choice that he's making, in this case about being vegan, is for him a source of coherence. It's a small step, but he believes that it is a part of being in a society where he understands companies are making profit by exploiting the planet, so we have to do our part and put our money into companies that are doing things differently. So it's consistent with studies on lifestyle choices and the way that they understand political action. And the last one we called disempowered action or powerlessness to engage with the climate change. And this conception of agency or lack of action was particularly noted among non-activist young people that were living in smaller towns. And they believe that on the one hand, they might not understand yet enough about the climate change debate on the one hand, or on the other hand, they did not consider to have enough resources or ability to impact a meaningful change in this topic. And other reasons for sensing a lack of agency, pointing out by these participants, were the shortcomings of global political actors and an overall sense of societal inaction. Notably, among the climate activist participants on the first conception of agency that we underpinned, these were considered reasons to act. But for these participants, they believed that these were unsurmountable barriers. And so they didn't think that they could do anything about it. So in conclusion, our results, our findings suggest that on the one hand, youth's conceptions of agency in relation to climate change are influenced by the youth's political subjectivities, their diverse modes of engagement, including, in this case, lack of action about the topic of climate change. We also found that young people build their sense of political agency through contextualized lived experiences, relational dynamics, and their own personal insights on their individual and on their collective power. We also saw that young people in our study managed barriers and difficulties in their attempts to tackle climate change, suggesting that agentic power can help to cope with subalternization of the youth and other structural barriers, to negotiate their political influence and to define what are their individual and collective roles. But we also saw that such barriers can also constrain and shape political agency, leading to, in some of our participants' cases, disempowerment. We also saw that conceptions of political agency encompass, on the one hand, reflections about present and past circumstances, but also looking into future possibilities to impact some level of change. And finally, we believe that these conceptions of agency are not static. So we saw that it is possible to encourage youth empowerment by creating structures and opportunities for engagement and for further participation of the youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Now Daniela will be presenting on youth climate activist groups in particular and their political imaginaries.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for being here and for listening again. So for this presentation, we have to recover the concept of political imaginary that Tânia described and at the beginning, and think about how climate change has been communicating for the past few years. And thinking in this context and having this in mind, seeing the growth of global young climate movement that is actually stimulating the climate debate, questioning the status quo and the conventional structure behind policy decisions. that is performing a different, even opposing a political imaginary, is of enormous scientific relevance. So in this work, we ask what kind of society is envisioned by young activist groups and how they do propose achieving it. Okay, so to answer this, we looked at the Portuguese context, and we analyzed texts from websites and Instagram posts of 4 climate groups in Portugal, Climaximo, that we have here today, School Strike for Climate Portugal, Ambientalist, and Lidera. And in this work, I won't describe it, but we follow the principles of critical discourse analysis. Okay, so we mapped the political imaginaries of these groups, these 4 groups, through 4 core themes that emerged from our analysis. And these include our group's position about the prevailing social political system and alternatives, which include discourse of rupture and continuity, the prevailing socioeconomic system and alternatives, where we found discourses from modernization to thorough understandings and interpretations, climate justice, where we found hints of recognition and intersectionality versus global voice being portrayed, and senses of political agency, where we looked at how groups build a collective identity and what roles they assign to themselves. Okay, looking at the selected groups, Climaximo and School Strike for Climate present a more transformative imaginary. They advocate for social, political, and social economic arrangements closer to proposals like eco-socialism and degrowth. And we have, we can read in the School Strike for Climate discourse in the first piece of text. Eco-socialism is a political movement for the future based on safeguarding ecological balances, preventing healthy environments, defending workers, and rejecting the capitalist mode of production. So these arrangements support bottom-up deliberative democracy, where values such as justice, recognition, and inclusion are prioritized. These groups are very specific in pointing out who is most affected by climate change: workers, students, women, the unemployed, racialized people, etc. And therefore, they clearly note the intersectional problem, the intersectionality of the climate crisis. Also, these groups prefer direct actions and civil disobedience in the form of streets demonstrations, occupation, and physical blockades. According to these groups, these actions are justified because governments are failing to act in the face of the climate emergency, therefore are not representing the true interests of the population. And we also can read one example of their opposition about the conventional discourse. The divide that has already opened up is between those who fight tooth and nail to preserve this system, applying a few cosmetic reforms to do it in order to soften protests, and those who have the courage and political strength to demand a new system, detaching themselves from the old business as usual and using their sense of creativity and justice to imagine the world of the future. So these groups suggest that people should mobilize and take to the streets. Okay, on the other hand, we have 2 groups, Lidera and Ambientalist. They understand and assess reality and the future in a more moderate, conservative, reformist way. Their discourses are aligned with mainstream ideas about sustainable development and ecological modernization. For them, representative democracy is a viable form of democracy, but only if citizens have enough knowledge to make informed choices. Therefore, these groups prefer to act by providing certificate knowledge to their audience. In terms of action, they prefer more conventional spaces of action, such as writing open letters in the form of petitions, in the case of Ambientalist, or meetings with public institutions like the Minister of the Environment on leader side. They agree that governments are not acting with the urgency that climate change requires, but there is time and space to reform our institutions like the banking sector. And we can read on that open letter, money continues to be a crucial focus in the lives of the overwhelming majority of the members of society, be they individuals or companies. It is essential not to overlook this fact to outline an appropriate strategy for sustainable development. So it is a very different discourse. They also understand that climate change affects the global population, but there is little openness and or recognition to discuss the dimension of climate justice. These groups demonstrate how there are solutions to the problem, reinforcing already outlined institutionalized strategies like the Paris Agreement, and somehow some market solutions. You can look at how they try to mobilize people, no matter where you came from. If you are under 35, have an entrepreneurial mindset and leadership spirit, apply to through the link in our bio. Okay, to summarize, we observe that young climate groups have attempted to revitalize the discourse on climate change, which is preserved as a complex and unappealing problem for democracy. The plurality of political imaginaries reflects the diversity of social political stances within youth-led climate movements in Portugal and their commitment to explore alternative ways of governing climate change. So on one hand, we found elements of a dominant political imaginary, a more reformist discourse about climate change on leader and ambientalist discourses, more transformative groups like Climaxima and School Strike for Climate challenge the prevailing neoliberal narrative, expose unequal social dynamics, and discuss climate alternative policy. And following Amanda Masham interpretation, the emergence of alternative imaginaries like these ones can energize the democratic debate on climate change. And despite these differences, these political imaginaries should be read agonistically and not antagonistically. According to Chantal Mouffe, maintaining the democratic debate requires embracing disagreements and conflicting views rather than striving for consensus, which can suppress diversity and dissent. We know that discussions and negotiations on the governance of climate change will be permanently marked by uncertainties and conflicts, and no one view will ever be fully suitable for everyone. So we suggest that the debate must be preserved and nurtured with discussions about the social, the political, the cultural contingencies around the causes of climate change. And we also suggest that the concept of political imaginaries should be a guiding concept to work with young people to foster their political agency. Thank you so much. Okay.
And now we'll have an opportunity, now that we've discussed different political imaginaries, one some more reformist and others more transformative, we'll have the opportunity to discuss how these were presented on television.
Hi, so I am going to be talking about how these movements, how the youth movements in Portugal features on media. I'm going to talk about two studies we conducted with Tânia, myself, and Anabela. One of the studies is already published in Communication Review. The other is still under peer review. So the first one, Young Climate Activists in Television News, an analysis of multimodal constructions of voice, political recognition, and co-optation. To talk about this, allow me to make two small introductory points. There are already lots of introductory points made to this study. There is the notion of protest frame when we talk about social movements at large and climate change social movements in particular. the literature suggests that when we are talking about the last 5 years of youth climate activist movements, we don't really see a great deal of protest frame. Instead, the proposal is we have some kind of an intergenerational justice frame where the body of activists or policing of activists or some kind of invisibility or impersonalization of the activists is not there, but activists are youthful, present, hopeful, and full of agency on the TV screen. So another issue when we look at the more critical part to this intergenerational frame is that there is a bit of ageist framing or infantilization of the activists. Here we are talking about findings from Finland, Germany, the UK, and Australia. If I remember correctly, there are more countries probably. When you look at at least the first couple of years between 2018, 19, 20, and the studies suggest that the activists are mostly framed in a school attendance or truancy frame. They are also framed with emotional uprising, and also their agency and perspectives are undermined. So this is the background of this study. In Portugal, we also know that in the newspaper Público, there has been some limited voice and recognition given to the youth activist movements, at least, once again, at least at the outset of the movement. In this study, drawing on the notion of voice, we asked two questions. To what extent do Portuguese television channels offer voice to young climate activists? According to this framework, media offers voice, but at the same time gets back the voice without its proper use. So the detailed questions are how and in what settings do Portuguese television news offer direct voice to young climate activists? Here we distinguish between direct and indirect voice, meaning that do they actually speak on the TV? Second, whether and how does the relation to official political discourse grant youth climate activists some recognition as civic actors of climate politics? We looked at 230 news videos that come from RTP1, SIG, and TVI news channels in the 2018-2021 period. And we applied a multimodal content analysis looking at, I'm going to just show very briefly and not analyze in depth. When we talk about the multimodal content analysis, we are talking about on the right-hand side, we have the frame, so the visual image with all the confusion, so to say, going inside this. You know, it's moving, there are people, there are faces, there are movements, and there is police, there is not police, all this inside the image. And then below it, there is the caption, in this case, courage is needing to curb climate change. And then there is typically some kind of a voice given to the activist. What activist says something, and then there is the voiceover from the media. Somebody is talking over that. So these are the, when we talk about multimodal, we are talking about all these different modes, the different resources for meaning making. Because I'm going to go to more detail in the next study, I am passing this. Basically, we looked at all these different layers of meaning and we coded them. And our conclusion was that Portuguese TV channels actually offered considerable amount of voice to climate activists in the news. It's a largely positive representation of youth climate activism in some contrast with other countries. However, their demands are depicted as aligned with mainstream political agenda. So there was a lack of depth of discussion, failure in pluralizing the climate change debate. So young climate activists and their relationship with political and institutional spaces suggests that there is some kind of a political recognition going on together with co-optation, in the sense that the voice is offered to the youth climate activists, but their voice, in a way, they are not allowed to finish the sentence. They are just able to say, climate change is so important, boom, let's go to the next one. So it was, roughly speaking, this kind of a simplified presentation, but a very positive presentation of the image of the activist. Now, we need to discuss this finding, getting a little bit deeper. Let's not forget that we were looking primarily to the, let's say, the first years in the very outset of the activist actions. So in the beginning, as you might remember, it's an overly simplified timeline, obviously. In the beginning, there were peaceful street demonstrations, strikes, and eventually the groups took to the streets for more disruptive street protests and even road blockages with the refinery, with Umberto Delgado Airport, and even more disruptive actions. Eventually, now we are in the phase of, let's say, occupying different spaces in the cities, primarily the universities and the high schools. So obviously, more peaceful street demonstrations are more accepted forms of claims making, and a change in tactics going through more disruptive dissent, we can expect some difference in media representations. The second study is actually drawing on the same corpus of news, but is focusing on a very small case, so to say. And before getting into this case, I need to also make two very short introductory remarks. One, these are our assumptions before the study. Journalistic editing decisions can create interactions that open up or close down alternative perspectives, such as the youth agency. This way, they either open the political to new points or they shut it down. And in more detail, multimodal discursive spaces on TV, that is the juxtaposition of talk, image, and text, may allow for different particular interactions among social actors. Our question in this study is, how do these interactions unfold? Our case is just one video inside this 230, just one, but this was a 17-minute reportage aired on primetime TV on CIES channel, open channel, on January 4, 2023. So this is, if you realize, it's later, in the later stage of the protest. So this is when already the occupations were in place. It is called The Disciples of Greta, Stories of Three Young Environmentalists. And it features one student from student climate strike in Lisbon and two from Lidera. Our analysis focuses on the multimodal discursive actions employed to depict and position young activists. Before getting into a little bit more detail, I want to say we must recognize that 17 minutes in the prime time is a really lot of space given to this kind of discussion. And in this sense, before criticizing, I should recognize that Portuguese TV, and especially this piece, did actually a great job in putting all these discussions to prime time. However, so there are two different activists I'm just going to present quickly. So one is called Matilda. Matilda's voice of in this in this particular moment, I think in something like minute 5, gets into saying with some police image and news caption, young people pledge to continue occupations. Matilda says, we hear that criticism a lot from people. They say you should be at the parliament instead. We have already been to the parliament. We have also been to the Ministry of Economy before this action, and nothing happened. Schools are the spaces that society has chosen for us to project ourselves into the future. And this future, I am not sure if it's going to happen. So I just, at the outset, I had mentioned about the protest frame. Here we see whenever Matilda and this movement that Matilda embodies goes to the streets, there is police presence, and there is a certain, how you say, suppressing of the action. So, and second thing, Matilda is, when Matilda is not in the street, but when she's interviewed in an inside space, probably school, she's alone. And it's a kind of a distant shot. And then, yeah, the news caption, all these meanings, all these layers producing meaning together are going to make much more sense when we compare it with the next activist persona. Who is Francisco? Francisco is presented this way. Francisco and Matilda have the same aspirations and concerns, but their approaches are different. And the news caption says, Francisco teaches and provides teaching to other young people. Next shot, Francisco is given voice. He says, I believe that young people like me have to bring irreverence to political discourse, but above all, we have to convey a message with a substance, conteúdo, because that will determine whether we prevent society from polarizing. And it's nicely said that Francisco exchanged the car for a scooter. So in quick comparison, there is lots of layers of meaning, lots of things to analyze here. I don't have the time, but basically Francisco is depicted as a person who's already making some positive change. Whereas before his coming, some images of young people jumping in the streets are by exactly his wording of we need to convey a message with a conteúdo. So what comes before doesn't have a content. So this, in a way, the whole organization of the editing gets this message out. So this is one of our points that we make in the paper. Another one, I can't go to deep analysis of this. I just want to focus you on the middle segment here. Here we have the, perhaps the top climate scientist or one of the important climate scientists in Portugal, the voice of science in Portugal. He says these actions are, in the end, to be expected to happen. What is sometimes disappointing is that the level of education and information that these activists have is actually very low. Then comes Matilda. And then she kind of concedes, I am 18 years old, I know enough, but maybe I don't know everything. So in a way, who is put in contact with whom, who is juxtaposed with whom? The youth climate activists, which is more disruptive, which takes to the streets, are taking into also with another, we can't give all the examples here, with another high school teacher. They are also depicted as, well, they want so much change, but are they stopping using their cars? So there is always this discussion between two types of activists. And this is our main conclusion in here. In this second study, we highlight a dissociation between the disruptive activist persona and the dutiful type. I think it's already clear who is disruptive and who is dutiful. Through this distinction between two characters, a distinction between disruptive and dutiful dissent is made. And multimodal strategies are employed to delegitimize the first, whereas the climate activist proper, we could say, whereas legitimizing the other one. We didn't have time to pass in detail, but science and education are conferred epistemic authority at the expense of the voices and imaginaries of young people. So yes, science is legitimized, which is a positive thing, but then youth is depicted as, well, we don't know very much, they don't know very much, they have to study. So whereas one activist type is education, already in educational mode, the other is depicted as, well, we don't know enough. And this is the point I stop and leave to Tânia.
Thank you. Yeah, so now that we have some of these dynamics of how the youth have been imagining their agency in these issues, political imaginaries being proposed, how this has been received in the media, I'm going to shift gears a bit and discuss some aspects of this concept of political imaginaries that, as Daniela discussed, that should be somehow an entry point to discuss political agency with the youth. And for this, I will probably draw from more on research on social psychology and how this idea of imagined futures and how it relates to collective action. And some of the most consistent research developed so far understands that for the youth to be involved in collective action, they need to have an idea of what the future might look like, of a positive future. They should be hopeful. So somehow these are the expected dynamics to be involved and to be part of change. But what we found from being in contact with this literature and also with the focus groups that were conducted with different types of youth, and some of them being part of collectives, is that climate action seems to be more motivated by ideas of dystopia, of a post-apocalyptic scenarios, because they bring fear and anger to the fore. So Mali was discussing how there have been some depictions in the media that they've been emotional, but these emotions are actually crucial for more involvement. And this is important because whereas some sort of a hopeful understanding of the future can also be a way of mitigating responsibility. So to think of a dystopia, to think of a post-apocalyptic scenario in the present, and this to be the motivation for collective action, also brings attention to the now and how the future might be tucked away, but the now is crucial for us to somehow pave and modulate new futures to come. So instead of fostering some of, social psychology findings were very much, we need to promote utopian thinking so people get involved with action. What we found in some of these discussions so far is that hope is actually something that comes after action. So it derives from the experience of collective action. It's not a precondition. And with hope then comes some sort of utopian thinking, what could be a real utopia, because a real utopia would have into consideration the contingencies of the future, of how it's unstable. And for that, I understand this to be somehow the ingredients for political imaginaries to then be co-created, to be these dynamic constructions that are being, simmered together among the youth. To really delve into these ideas of utopias, dystopias, of post-apocalyptic scenarios, and to bring the emotional side to how political imaginaries are conceived, I draw from this concept of effective discursive practices that understand discourse jointly with affect, and how affect is different from emotion. So I think, well, I don't think, but literature on affective theory will point towards this idea that emotion is not an individual experience. It's not something that happens to us. It's something that happens to all of us. We are somehow moved. We are affected by our contexts and our realities, very much how discourse is all encompassing. It's embodied, and it creates the tables and the rooms that we're in. Affect is also part of those dynamics. And having that in mind, so affect is actually very much related to more of embodied ways of collating data, but to put together with discursive practices is to really understand how discourse is imbued with affect and with emotions. And so my proposal for this study was to understand how these dystopian and utopian imaginaries were charged with this emotional side can be contributing to ideas of what is feasible, and feasible facing the uncertainties of the future. So as I said, we picked on the focus group developed especially with climate collectives. There was a focus group guide that really delved into agency, political involvement, future political imaginaries. And so again, this came to reiterate what most of the research has shown, is that the post-apocalyptic scenario, saying that the crisis is being lived right now, was very prevalent, and that utopian impulses came somehow from that sense of despair or grief. So I highlighted over there a metaphor that I think it's really powerful. If I could choose any image to describe climate change, it would be a car going the wrong way against a wall and accelerating. So this is, I actually got the goosebumps right now, because it really comes to the sense of despair and lack of agency and a lack of possibility. But at the same time, Leonardo continues by saying, I don't think it's possible to reverse, but I still think it's possible to mitigate a lot of things. So it's kind of like this dance between being in a sense of despair and at the same time finding little cracks of hope or of utopian impulses that we somehow described. And one of the most interesting things of this data is that an idea of a very specific utopia, that is one that it's very well thought and very well imagined, was not very prevalent in our data. There's actually this awareness of the flexibility needed to find the perfect society, the society for the future, where we want to go next. Because at the same time, utopias, as I put in bold up there, in utopias, there is no activism. So it's really a state of non-existence. at the same time, there are ideas that are important, such as to be respected and included, to have no capitalism, building for the same purposes. But again, it comes to this assumption or this idea that it's really hard to envision or to create a clear path that we should do this now for this to happen next. So in bold, in the bottom of the extract, this participant discusses how we are extremely complex, and imagining that there is a general solution for us to organize a social society is difficult. There is no way. So to touch upon some of also Daniela's discussion on how conflict is always present. So it's supposed to exist so we can move somehow forward. We are not reaching some sort of consensus. So just to conclude, I draw from Donna Haraway to think of how these dystopian imaginaries may be ways of staying with the trouble, to be in the muddy waters, to somehow find new ways and new paths to go forward. Hope then is something that comes afterwards, and the absence of a thick and concrete, collectively elaborated utopian imaginaries, and instead to find a language of contingency. It opens spaces for what we call utopias in negotiation. And this might be necessary to deal with the unknown. So to kind of like tap into responsibilities, to have the ability to respond. And this then should be the ingredients for these political imaginaries to be in the making. We've ended all presentations. Now I'll invite Anabela for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, as project coordinator, I have to speak of the honor and privilege that it has been to work with this wonderful team. Thank you all. I'll just say in 2 slides, we promise very short, that we are at the very final stages of the project. Our next step is to put together these collaborative workshops on political agency, where we want to draw on many of the findings that have been presented here. And to be honest, many of them are not really ready made conclusions or finalized insights because of the nature of what we are dealing with, and in all this instability and contingencies that Tânia was talking about. But we want to work with activists on the one hand and non-activists as well in these collaborative workshops in trying to stimulate thinking about political possibilities around climate change and about the agency of young people, and address this question of how can they strengthen their voice in collective action in relation to climate change, or how can they develop a different sense of or different senses of political agency in various public spheres. And just to finalize with a few questions, because as I was saying, we have a series of new ideas. Research generates more research and more questions often, and dealing with climate change and with the idea of political imaginaries to address climate change, we really have to keep thinking on this around this path of reflection on political possibilities. Climate change is eminently a political matter, and it's one that brings together many different axes of society, that brings together time, space, different scales, that it involves many layers of risk and threat, and so it's very unsettling and poses a series of new challenges. And so we can only expect new thinking in political terms, but where are the sites where this new thinking can emerge, and how can it be stimulated? So expanding horizons of possibility in terms of political possibilities to address climate change will continue to be in these workshops and beyond, we are sure, of prime interest for us, as well as again stimulating a sense of agency for young people and non-young people, as well. The worlds of climate activism and non-activism should be more frequently brought together, and the bridges between them are an issue, are a problem. There's a strong divide very often between the groups of people, and we find that in our research as well, the groups of people that are involved in climate activism and the vast majority of young people that I know. And worse, that often have, in Portugal and elsewhere, a lot of prejudice and a lot of resistance, we have to say, to the idea of activism and to the identity of activists. And so part of this, we believe, has also to do with the public image of activism and activists, and we expressed some of those problems here in our analysis, in bringing together journalists and other voices in public fora to think about this. We also, I think, is important, how can activism gain a better, a more positive image. In particularly the disruptive forms of thinking. We need, from what I said around the first question, we definitely need very novel, very transformative ways of envisioning possibilities of going in society, of organizing ourselves. And yet these disruptive forms of thinking often are stigmatized, are via various means either concealed or selectively co-opted, and recognizing the need for this transformative thinking and having their relevance and their value recognized, we think is an important mission for future projects and future research and future action as well. If we think of ourselves as academics that may try to also do some change in the real world. So that's just some final thoughts. Thank you all.
So it was very interesting, and so I think we can move to discussion. We have 1 hour. We don't need to spoil the hour, but I think that we will, because we have many. There are many fascinating comments. So maybe we just we can start the discussion. So it's open. And we can collect questions, comments, also from home. I already have myself many, but I don't want to. You can also ask questions each other. But maybe we saw the
Yeah.
Yeah,
maybe you can start.
I try not to spy all the time. So yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoy your presentation, your plural presentation. Was also very nice. The articulation between all the perspectives and the axis of the project. And well, this we have had some presentation on these issues, but with this articulation, I think it was very interesting, the relation with the aspect of emotion, the aspect of framings, the different axes. And about the point of the framing, I think is for me one of the points I was working also, particularly in related to anti-austerity movement. And there was this issue of spontaneity that was very interesting, because particularly such movement studies were really built against the idea of spontaneity. So to contrast this idea, irrational idea of collective action as something irrational without any directions, without any clear goal, and that's all. So the idea of spontaneous, always such movements literature has always underlined as stressed aspects of resources, organization, and strategies, and all these aspects. And on the other side, exactly to remove such movements from the field of kind of irrational actions and without goals, etc. So there was a kind of movement in social movements literature to even a little bit too extreme to bring them to another area where everything is controlled, everything can be analyzed, but on the other side there is another movement in the media coverage that is underline spontaneity, and spontaneity sometimes is tricky. Sometimes is used this in terms of spontaneity as something good. So such a movements or what the media think that are such a movements are not corrupted because they are spontaneous. They don't have legal parties with trade unions, with a kind of established organization. So they are not systemized. There is this idea of inorganic that I still don't know what it means because I think it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in reality. So there is this kind of myth of spontaneity that is used a little bit as sometimes to denigrate, like they are maybe to infantilize or to say that they don't have, they are nice and funny people, but they really don't have any strategy, any clear goal, or they are not really well educated. Sometimes is used to celebrate this idea of they are ingenious, they are naive, they are not corrupted, they are clean and position of institutional politics considered corrupted and so on. So and so this is there is kind of a literature about this, and I think it's very interesting. Also that well, if you have some takes to say about that, about this idea of spontaneity can really be a little bit manipulating the direction that is more useful for the fact. For instance, in my study on media coverage, it was exactly about TV media coverage during austerity. I compared strikes and other kind of actions, like particularly new social movements actions, etc. And strikes were really covered in a very much more negative way. And large demonstrations were really considered media friendly, like the idea of spontaneity was very present, and the way it was framed was positive. So they are spontaneous and not like trade unions that are organized, they're corrupted, they're always well. Just I think maybe I stop here just about this. And the emotions is very interesting. And there is this exactly because of this stressing the more rational aspect of mobilization since the 70s. Now there is a rediscovering of emotions since such movements start this more in the area of sociology, because I don't know very well the studies in social psychology, also is my fault. And studies by particularly Jane Jasper, he wrote this fantastic book by Passionate Politics and so on. And there is just some kind of few suggestions about this idea of emotions in social movements, and I don't know what your take about that. So that same emotions can mobilize or can demobilize. This depends on the way they are framed also by the organization, and the organizational rules and the meanings that is attributed to specific to fear, to indignation, or to. So just if you find this, if you're with yeah, for sure.
I can sense everything.
That's a lot. So
Just maybe a few things about this last aspect of emotional readings of the value of emotions. I mean, what Tânia was saying is in some ways very novel, and because most of the literature, particularly on climate change communication, within the broad communication discipline, phrases the idea of hope and positive messaging around climate change, and the idea that you can you need to be empowered by being shown some path to act and by some possibilities to enact that change, rather than being presented with a series of threats with which or towards which you feel that you cannot do anything. So there's some articles that are indeed are based on empirical analysis and by using visuals and stuff and assessing people's reactions in relation to them, to showing them a solar panel versus a flooded city or something. And of course, this all depends on the design of the studies and on the questions that you ask people and on how you put things together. But indeed, it seems like that there are grounds to believe that it is important to offer that sense of agency. There we go again, right? At the same time, more recently, I think there's been an interest in the idea of fear as energizing, as a way to, or as a basis to start acting on something, to move people towards, if not an organized action, at least towards speaking and expressing feelings about this, and maybe from there something else will emerge. But the kind of reading that Tânia was offering, I think, is very interesting in the sense of bringing together the idea of dystopias and together with political imaginaries. Because you could think that these things are just at odds with each other, right? Like there's no politics or there's no good politics, there's no desirable politics in future chaos and devastation. But at the same time, maybe that sense of despair and knowing that you are going towards the abyss acts as an emotional force towards rethinking if not about coming up with a perfect formula or political solution to address the issue, at least as you were saying, find little cracks, your expression, right? Little spaces where some possibilities of organizing, of doing things differently or thinking about things differently can emerge out of that scenario of devastation. So, the balance between these two things, hope and, a pathway of change and hope in front of us is and on one hand, and fear and despair and dystopia. I think is a very interesting thing to look into, but maybe you want to.
Yes, no, it's just, I think these are all dilemmatic. They can go either way. I think it really highlights how we should somehow work with both of them. So I think there is a collective and hegemonic somehow tendency to avoid to think about collapse, because that really comes with a lot of emotional consequences. And because there's such a society where we are not really in touch with our own emotions or what is going on with our bodies, then we don't allow ourselves to feel fear, And I think the youth bringing that emotional expression, they are not afraid of feeling fear, because fear and anger come hand in hand at the same time. So they kind of they come with a composite that.
In particularly, sometimes fear of repression, and not just meaning just feeling fear of or indignation, also that is particularly well strong here, but in a certain context, like Mexico, etc., is much stronger. So sometimes it's just not fear about the future, but fear about what is the consequence. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. And you would say that is.
It can be mobilizing or not.
Yes, of course. Of course. I think that when discussing climate futures in particular, because we can talk about fear at different levels, I don't think there should be some sort of taboo of looking at the collapse that might be that might come, you know. We should face it in a way, because that is a way to open spaces of, you know, creativity. You know, go into the depths to come and to have other perspectives on life and on society. But of course, I agree that fear is also paralyzing, you know, of course. But at the same time, hope can be paralyzing in the sense that everything will be all right. So why should I bother? Why should I get involved in that way?
It can be both, in the sense
Yes.
it can be paralyzing or mobilizing.
Yeah.
You can have double effect.
Yes. So in terms of communication, for instance, when we are looking for a perfect formula, maybe that's difficult because they can go both ways in a way. You know, maybe it's difficult to articulate the complexity of having one on the other side of the other, of having one as being influencing the other, you know, thinking about these emotional cores of positive and negative.
So if I may say just a small thing about what we have said, I don't know the literature you mentioned on spontaneity. The only thing I can relate to spontaneity is, you know, the distinction we were talking about, social psychology and mass psychology. So basically spontaneity is a kind of a threat almost, like at least from the, at the minimum from the perspective of the statu quo, but also even for each of us, like, you know, spontaneous environments are like anything can happen. Yeah? So we don't want it. And also from the protest paradigm, like any established power doesn't want thousands and millions of people in the street because there is whole mass psychology and all these things. And, you know, there is this old literature from already from 20th century, I think, how to suppress these people, how to control these people. You fly a helicopter, etc., etc. So I think this is the primal fear that you were talking about. Like this fear is over here, and I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question exactly, but now I'm also going to distinguish the fear now here in the spontaneous moment in the street from the fear or any emotion about the future. And let me try to just remember, probably all of us will remember, like right away I can remember 20 films where this huge wave is so high that it's higher than New York. Okay, so we are so consumed. We have consumed so many of these images that I would like to doubt that we could have a fear of climate futures instead of a positive fear that could, in a way, mobilize us. Maybe we could address this phenomenon of the future catastrophe as a fantasy that's already, in a way, built in us from Hollywood. Like, we are the climate change for a serious percent of the population perhaps has answered to debates from this the day after tomorrow kind of fantastic.
Yeah, nice investigation.
There are so many. Of course, there are so many studies.
There's many studies in short term and medium term.
Yeah. So if I'm referring to fantasies, I'm actually referring to that literature. It's not just my personal view. So this is in a way, it's already in us. So just to conclude, I don't think we are facing, in the sense of the modern subject, that we are looking at the protest in the street. We are not facing the future catastrophe, as Latour would say, I think. The catastrophe, we already saw it like 15 times. We have lost New York, and then we have lost the other one, and then the girl kissed the boy, and we have been facing this catastrophe as in a fantasy level over and over. We are just consuming it.
For certain area of the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's also.
I mean, to take Katrina, right? Katrina was the big hope, perversely, right? That the discourses or the political positions were going to change, and they didn't. Despite seeing it in big scale, real life, US.
It's not about this topic. I'm sorry. Not about this topic or this topic.
And it's also like not comment or appreciation. I think I'm still processing. But it's more like of a question, because I've actually read one of the articles that you mentioned, and it was like this I felt that overall the appreciation about the climate, like the climate movement coverage in the news was more positive than at least in other countries. And then the article ended with, but then we are going to have occupations in Portugal and we'll have to see what happens. And in particular about the analysis that you did on television and so on. I was wondering if you've noticed, and I don't know if your research also allowed you to find data about this, but if you've noticed that there was less space for the climate activists to be present on the news after the beginning of the occupation, really, in particular in last year, because I think that this is a perception that we have, but we don't have data about it because it's really hard to compile media news.
Yeah, so I originally thought about doing that because we had the data, but it was a lot. I did go through everything, and from my just experience of watching news about youth climate activism, I could say that yes. I mean, it's not data, it's not analyzed, but our option was to pick this long piece that was in 2023 to kind of like to encapsulate what was going on, but a lot more happened. So I'm guessing that the presentation on television has also changed. But I did watch everything from 2021 until 2023. I did not analyze it, but I did watch it, and yes, it was different. I mean, it was less. There was less. These dynamics that we've seen in the first moment of analysis, when they would come with a microphone and people would talk and discuss, and they would be invited into the newsroom. I didn't see any of that at all. Yeah.
Just to support this, I think our presentation was kind of clear on one point, but let me just quickly reiterate. We can't say anything about the volume. So if the volume decrease or increase, that has to be done. Yeah. So somebody is going to do it hopefully soon. But what we kind of tried to show is that if in the, let's say 2019, around that time, we had one image of activists that was like in the street and walking peacefully, and yes, good boys, good girls, hey, support our climate cause. By 2023, there is at least a tendency that our second study tries to show this. Now we don't have one image, but it's split into two, the good boy and the bad boy, so to say. So I think I would agree that basically now there is a shift, probably with occupations and more disruptive actions. We can't really put the time exactly when, but somewhere between 2022 or 23 perhaps, somewhere there is more detail now because there are more voices over there also, and this initial beautiful image is already lost. We have to now somehow control this phenomenon. So I think this is what's going on.
Oh, because the way the doesn't go all the way until the end of 23, right?
I have
Until the end of 23.
I think I have a data set. Well, not the end of 2023. Probably till the end of 2022.
Yeah, but yeah.
I think
yes, it was the whole,
I think March 23, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
yeah, we do.
And so I think a lot of these changes happened afterwards, particularly with more on localized actions and not just mitigations, painting, painting, all that. The end of that certainly, certainly improved media. There was a significant change.
Oh, nice.
The press.
Yeah.
Nice.
Online newspapers, not TV.
Okay. Good.
Yes, and that presentation that I did in the sample last year, we talked about those actions.
Yes. It was the opinion articles, right?
Yeah, so it was very antagonizing opinion articles from Observador and other places. So yeah, we didn't really look into that period on TV. And we have and don't have systematically collected data for that because we started much earlier. But yeah, it's been an interesting shift because I mean you spoke about that protest frame and then classically in media and communication studies of activism, street activism in particular. This has been very much spoken about, and it's very clear, particularly on TV, that often all the attention was on to, the kind of more violent or destructive or whatever bit of the demonstration, often just performed by a small fraction of people that would be involved in a demonstration, but that would get all the action, right? Those people that would throw, that would set fire to garbage bins or break a few windows or whatever. And that was very prominent for, a large chunk of time in the reporting of demonstrations, particularly on TV. With very little discussion about the actual substance of the methods around which people were demonstrating or actually interviewing the dominant activist that was not violent. But Simon Cottle and other people then started speaking about some shifts towards that in, I think, maybe 10, more than 10 years ago, and there was a more sympathetic view towards street demonstrations started emerging around various topics around the world. I guess there was a journalistic culture of somehow learning also a little bit with, okay, we can't just keep repeating on reporting on demonstrations in this way, and okay, let's find new frames and let's look into issues a little bit differently. And particularly then when the youth climate demonstrations emerged, there was very much this tendency towards, okay, let's go towards these genuine, as you were saying, naive, pure young people, and actually show them and have their voice a little bit, as we saw. Then interpretation and contextualization might be a different thing, and the big narrative might be a different thing. But at least there was more of this, okay, bringing in, creating room for these people. And then as the tactics changed, of course, we see these other changes, much more, okay, now resistance and backlash. And I think sometimes it feels like a sense of surprise of, how can this, how do they think that this can ever work? Very crazy. And again, so new forms of the sidelining and marginalizing activism seem to be on, unfortunately.
Just one small thing, very short. Actually, I had mentioned this with one word, and this is the time to maybe open it quickly. In the same protest paradigm, there is also the notion of personalization, depersonalization. Classically, all these years before, let's say 2017, 18, I don't know the years exactly, the typical street images, there is a mass of people, a body of people, they are mobilized. And then if there are some faces, they are covered with masks. It might be Bush, it might be whoever, there are some Clinton, whatever. So you don't have personas proper. And I think in this sense, the youth climate movement is perhaps very specific case that we have lots of faces, lots of names, lots of persons that people follow. Yeah. So Mathilde is, in a way, for our study, has been the persona of the activist, disruptive activist. But around the world, we have so many names. The reporters have been going and talking to these people, and in a way they have their stories. She stopped school. Oh, why did she stop school? So there's a drama in a way around their lives. Oh, she shouldn't stop the school. She should do the same, blah blah. Do both at the same time, etc., etc. Now, if this goes as Anabela is, and we are, I think, all witnessing it in an informal way. We also read this news now. Probably the news in the coming years and these times are no longer following activists in person. We will lose the sight of who is in the street. Just again, maybe behind the police barrier, some color is spread over there, and yeah, activists were doing this, finished. Like just this kind of, instead of the volume of this news, also I'm talking about the quality or the inner mechanics of how these things are put together.
The substance, right? I mean, again, we have no discussion about, why we need to really think differently and, make that statement in the public space. There's no scope for that. It's just an act. It's just a visual thing. there's no debating about this, the disruptive thinking that I was talking about, and the need for it. Which
Is there some more questions? No? Just to see if there is someone. Because I wasn't looking at it.
No, can I? So thank you. It was a lot of work, and you've done a lot of work, and it's a lot of food for thought. And I actually work on environmental movements as well, but on a different level. I work on transnational diffusion of XR, so slightly different, but some of the stuff that you said resonated. And I made a lot of notes, but I'm going to try to like make sense of them, my own notes, and organize them. But what I kept thinking over the presentation was, what exactly do you mean by young people? Right? So young people is such a broad category. So, you know, it's within young people, there are so many types of young people, so heterogeneous, that I'm thinking, who are these young people that we're talking about? I think we're mainly talking about students, but even so, what students are we talking about? What social class do they belong to? You know, what's their ethnic and racial background, and so on. And we know from studies in other countries that that is actually a very important way in which the climate movement builds itself, and actually the way it's represented as well. And so that's the first one, but also that brings me to the second one, which is where do these people come from? Who are they? And even in terms of activism, we're actually working on a paper that we will have to come next week, where we kind of trace the origins of the people that then are in XR. And a lot of them were previously in previous movements, all right? So, but these people that in Portugal, it's at least a bit younger, but I don't know. I haven't done much research on environmental movements in Portugal. Then also leads me to another finding that we have. Pete actually wrote the paper, I wasn't involved in that, from something we kind of, from the interviews we've done, especially in Anglophone countries, that, you know, we have this perception that the climate movement is essentially young people. But actually, when you do the interviews in these countries, a lot of them are old. Like now you would ask me, where's old people? But basically retired women who were very active in the 70s. And then they went on with their lives, and now they're back because they retired, and they're like, well, I have to have something to do. And then they got involved in XR, for instance. So, you know, I was wondering, did you find something similar in Portugal, or is that Portugal has more of like a young people, and because we never had such a strong environmental movement, that mechanism or that process doesn't really happen. But yeah, let's see if I can make sense of what I wrote here as well. And yeah, I'll stay. I think this is enough.
Yes, so our focus was young people for the overall project. So we really went looking for young people within the climate movement and beyond. So for instance, for the focus groups, we specifically tried to have a very diverse sample. So we went to different contexts, socioeconomic backgrounds. We worked with institutions and associations to refer to us young people from different backgrounds, such as social neighborhoods around marginalized areas in Lisbon and Porto, rural areas in some cases around Porto and Faro, Olhão. So we tried to encompass the most diverse sample possible. And most of them, yes, were students, but not only students. We also have some people who were young professionals until 35 years old. But the vast majority are secondary school students from 13. We actually have a few people with 13 years old, but the vast majority of the project encompasses people from 15 to 35. And within the climate movements, we also saw that, for example, Climáximo has people with all ages, whereas the School Strike for Climate is mostly composed of students, so younger people. And so there is the similar tendency of finding people in different ages, but we, for this project, specifically wanted to find young people. But in some groups, it was actually difficult to find very young people involved in activism.
But just to say, in this paper where we work with texts, we initially looked at extinction in Portugal, but we then we thought, okay, but they are not young people. We had this perception because of their Instagram posts. And even in the last meeting of climate justice in Boutique Vila Real, we saw someone from Extinction, and he's not young. He's not young at all.
Yeah.
So we have to exclude and giving voice to the young people, because we know that there are a lot of stereotypes about young people, and the age is a important thing to discuss, because there are very adultist stereotypes and aging stereotypes. So okay, we are focusing on young people, not the younger, but
Then just to contextualize a little bit, I mean, the project is a child of Greta. Let's just be clear about this. The project was developed around the time.
I get that, and I understand.
And it was this, I mean, it was this interest of, okay, on these new, really climate focusing movements, and there aren't very many at that time, and the decision of Rebelo was coming up as well, but it was, it seemed like it was mostly a movement, and then kind of, new forms of mobilization that was working among young people. So because of that nature of social mobilization, and because of the obvious importance of climate change for young people, and thinking in those intergenerational terms, and politically in those intergenerational terms, we thought, okay, let's focus primarily on these demographics. But having said that, we have struggled multiple times around this idea of, okay, where do we cut off? Yeah, it's sometimes doesn't make much sense even to be thinking in age terms or a number.
But I think there's this special concern of thinking of the youth as being chronically not part of politics. So I think that is something that it's underlying this project, is this concern that some people probably already, are over 18, they are having certain conditions, and the youth are really being excluded from decision-making processes from.
As I was listening to you, I kept thinking, it's funny, like, especially this infantilization kind of framing. It's funny because at the same time in the media you hear, young people will participate, this and that, but then when they participate, that's not the way you participate, right? And even I was thinking about the protests in the US, the Camp for Palestine. I mean, the whole deal and the way that framing was done was not that far from this as well. Like, participate, but not in this way, because you're not right, right?
I think we have to give it. Television is also a specific medium of communication that, of course, has its own constraints. And to be honest, time is very precious, and the existence of imagery is very important for reporting and all that, and that creates a series of vices and bad habits in terms of putting things together. But there's a lot of good print press where not everything is negative, right? I mean,
of course,
and even in Portugal, we have to acknowledge there's some good reflections and a significant amount of space and interest in some media for these things. And so you know, and this has had, I think, socially and politically, this whole thing has had impact. I mean, we saw Franz Timmermans there saying, we, at this part, we owe the European Green Deal to Greta's movement, whether it's true or not. I mean, it's always difficult to assert these things. But the fact is that, you know, around that time, there's all these climate emergency declarations. There was all these, you know, the European Commission said this is the mission, the top of the goal or the mission of a generation. We really need to commit together and fully to addressing climate change. And the fact is that, unfortunately, in the last few years, everything has, you know, been shifting, and priorities have been changing, and thinking has been going the ways we know, with a series of backlashes and yeah.
And here we are.
What?
And here we are.
And here we are. This is God knows, no one can plan or anticipate exactly what the outcomes will be.
Some comments on I was just thinking, well, let's find the discourses, because for many years, since where the anti-state movements or the global cycle of the death started with Occupy, etc., there were like media studies of social movements almost disappeared. Studies on mainstream media almost disappeared with the advantage of the media. So studies. So there were a lot of studies on Twitter and particularly Twitter, particularly on the Arab Spring, etc. Now there is a new wave, I think, of studies on media coverage of particularly related to environmental action. You know, we discovered and we realized that people continue to read the newspaper and this and that. For me, a lot of people, this is the source of knowledge about what's happening on activists. But on the other side, it is true that there is a big change that before and after digital tools. Like now, such a movement, they have more to deal with mainstream media coverage, because they have their own communication tool, so they can even balance the coverage, the negative coverage sometimes. So it is already this aspect, which is interesting, balancing maybe the coverage invested, for instance, of the global justice movement. Really was completely demolished by, it was constantly that when there was demonstration, I remember in Italy in the late 90s, it was kind of like, wow, like it was really described as like people stay home and don't leave your apartment because this can be dangerous. And after it was dangerous, but not because of the activists. Actually, it was because of police. But so I think that also this is due to it's also thanks to the fact that the social movements have their own too, so that the media, the mainstream media cannot do really whatever they want. There is a balance. And I think this is very interesting.
I think that the different roles, I mean,
Yeah.
complementary, but kind of different because, of course, social media is very important for organizing and for speaking to your public, but to speak past that.
That's true, but also you can
is-
always show on YouTube something, a police action, and after this can be produced, and the mainstream media cannot really can say that this wasn't true, but still to have a YouTube video that's circulating in a digital sphere is also.
The dialogues between professional media and social media can be interesting, but also when we studied we found that most of what happened, for instance, in Twitter was in terms of big followings and stuff was actually drawing on the professional news media stories that were reproduced and commented or that became more popular. We were expecting for a lot more space and visibility by citizens and social movements and that was not really the case. So it's kind of a space where it depends on the topics
there
and
are
on the
also many
moments. I
mainstream
believe.
media that use the stories from digital social media, digital media social movements to cover certain.
Oh yeah, sure,
Yeah.
sure. It's an important source can be and the trigger sometimes for reporting, but if you wanted to read be able to reach and have some sort of impact
Yeah.
on a bigger audience, I think
Sure.
going via the professional news media continues to be important.
Mhm. So maybe we will finish here. What do you think?
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and discussion. And I hope that you join us more, or you start joining us in the seminar, and I think it will be a nice contribution to our discussion here. And we will travel continuity in rooms, maybe rooms for the seminars. Like we have today, and thank you very much, and every nice Sunday.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and congratulations on your 10th anniversary.
Yes.
You said you were going to say something more about that, right?
Yeah, we will have a day about we will be focusing more on the housing rights. So we will have a session called on the vita democrazia, and it will be also dedicated to Brit avant-garde, and we created a seminar in 2014, and my idea also, and Tiago still doesn't know, it would be to change the name to call it Brit avant-garde instead of something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Brit avant-garde such a seminar series is an idea to say this in October, and so to have a new path from that. Yeah. But I will keep you updated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sim.
90% das nossas reuniões estão aqui.
Eu fiquei mais surpresa.